Imagine this. It is the dead of night in the heart of the African jungle. The year is 1964. Rebels have taken over the city of Nebobongo in the northeastern Congo, and the darkness outside is split not by stars, but by the orange flicker of burning buildings. Somewhere in that chaos, a woman kneels on the dirt floor of a hut. Her white coat, the one she wore to surgeries just hours ago, is torn. Her face is bruised. Her hands, the same hands that have delivered hundreds of babies, sutured wounds and performed surgeries with nothing more than a kerosene lantern and a prayer, are trembling. She has just been beaten. She has just been violated, and she is alone. But here is what will astonish you. What will make you stop breathing for just a moment? This woman does not break. She does not curse the God she serves. She does not run. She whispers something into the darkness, something that would take the rest of her life to fully understand. Something she would spend decades trying to explain to crowded auditoriums, in churches, in books, in tears. A message that has echoed across generations of believers and changed the meaning of suffering forever. Her name is Helen Roseveare, and this is her story. Stay with me until the very end of this video, because there is a detail about Helen's life. One final, striking, almost unbelievable revelation that most people never hear. I am saving it for last, and I promise you, it will change the way you think about faith, pain, and purpose entirely. Welcome to Her Faith Echoes, the channel where we tell the stories of women throughout history whose faith was so fierce, so stubborn, so impossibly beautiful, that the world could not contain it. Women who were forgotten by textbooks but never forgotten by God. Women whose voices were silenced in their time, but whose echoes, their echoes reach us still. If you are new here, welcome. You have arrived at exactly the right moment. This community is for anyone who has ever wrestled with faith in the dark. Anyone who has ever wondered whether God shows up in suffering. Anyone who needs to be reminded that ordinary women just like the ones in your family, women just like you, have done extraordinary, world-altering, history-shaping things in the name of love. If that is you, please subscribe right now. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. And if you are already part of this family, welcome back. You know what we do here. We go deep. We go real. And today, we are going deeper and more real than we ever have before. Because the story of Helen Roseveare is not a comfortable story. It is not a tidy story. It is not the kind of story that ends with a bow and a hymn and everyone going home feeling good. It is a story full of blood and mud and screaming children and impossible choices. It is a story of a woman who gave everything, and I mean everything, and then discovered that even that was not too much. Before we begin, I want you to do something. I want you to put your phone down. Or if you are driving, I want you to let these words settle into your chest, because this is not background noise. This is someone's life, a real life, a life that touched thousands of other lives, a life that is still touching ours, right now, in this moment. Are you ready? Then let us go back to the beginning. When Helen Roseveare was born on September 28, 1925 in Hertfordshire, England, a world that was still recovering from one war and had absolutely no idea that another, far more devastating one, was about to erupt. She was born into a middle-class family, the daughter of a gifted mathematician. From the very beginning, people noticed something about Helen. She was relentlessly, almost inconveniently intelligent, sharp as a blade, driven as a locomotive, and utterly unwilling to accept the limitations that a polite British society tried to place around the minds of young women. She won a scholarship to Clarendon School, a boarding school for girls, and she excelled. She had the kind of mind that did not just learn things. It consumed them, dissected them, demanded more, and she was ambitious, not in a vain way, in a hungry way. Like in the way that people are ambitious when they sense, somewhere in the marrow of their bones, that they were made for something very large and very specific, and they just have not found it yet. But for all her intellectual brilliance, Helen Roseveare carried inside her a kind of restlessness that no achievement could quiet. She was searching, reaching for something she could not name, and it was at Cambridge University, where she had earned a place to study medicine, becoming part of a generation of women who had to fight simply to be taken seriously in lecture halls, that she finally found it, or rather, it found her. In 1945, Helen Roseveare became a Christian, but not in the way we often imagine conversion, a quiet, peaceful surrender in a sunlit chapel. For Helen, it was more like a collision, a reckoning, a moment in which she looked at the claims of Jesus Christ and felt, with every neuron in her physician's brain and every fiber of her stubborn will, that they were true, unavoidably, uncomfortably, world-reshapingly true. She joined a Christian union at Cambridge and threw herself into faith with the same ferocity she threw herself into everything. She studied the Bible the way she studied anatomy, systematically, relentlessly, determined to understand every detail, and she prayed, not politely, not performatively. Helen prayed the way people pray when they actually believe that someone is listening, and somewhere in those years of study and prayer and growing conviction, a word began to form itself in her heart, a word that most comfortable British women in 1945 would have found alarming, not a word that would cost her everything she had not already given. Africa, not as a tourist, not as an observer, as a doctor, as a servant, as someone who would go to the places where there were no doctors, no hospitals, no running water, and no safety nets, and build something from nothing in the name of the God she had just met. She completed her medical degree with distinction and joined the Worldwide Evangelization Crusade, the WEC, a British missionary organization. She trained, she prepared. She said her goodbyes to the England she had always known, to the career she might have had in a gleaming London hospital, to the comfortable life that her intelligence and her degrees would have easily purchased. She set all of it down, and in 1953, at the age of 27, Dr. Helen Roseveare stepped off a plane and onto the red soil of the Belgian Congo. And nothing in her Cambridge training, nothing in her missionary preparation, nothing in all her reading and praying and hoping had fully prepared her for what she found. The Belgian Congo in 1953 was a vast, beautiful, broken place. Vast, nearly 1 million square miles of equatorial rainforest, mineral-rich earth, and winding rivers that had never appeared on any European map. Beautiful, breathtakingly, ferociously beautiful, with a biodiversity and a depth of human culture that would have taken 1,000 lifetimes to fully know. And broken by colonialism, by extraction, by the systematic destruction of African dignity and autonomy that Belgium had been conducting for decades with brutal efficiency. Helen was stationed in Nebobongo, in the Ituri region of the northeastern Congo. It was not a city. It was not even really a town. It was a clearing in the forest, a scattering of mud brick buildings, a place that existed because people had decided it should exist, and then survived because those same people refused to let it die. And the medical need there was staggering. People were dying of diseases that were entirely preventable and entirely treatable. If there were doctors, if there were medicines, if there were any kind of infrastructure at all. Women were dying in childbirth at rates that would have been considered medieval in England. Children were being wiped out by malaria, by dysentery, by infections that any British GP could have cleared up in an afternoon. And there was nothing. No hospital, no clinic worth the name, no trained medical staff, almost no supplies. Helen looked at all of this and felt something ignite inside her. Not despair, not the temptation to get back on the plane and go home, something closer to fury, the clean, clarifying kind of fury that says, this should not be, this must change, and I am here, so I will change it. She started with almost nothing, a few rooms, basic instruments, medicines that she rationed with the precision of a wartime field surgeon, because she knew that when they were gone, she did not know when she would get more. She performed operations by kerosene lamp because there was no electricity. She delivered babies in conditions that would have horrified any midwife back in England. She treated tropical diseases she had only read about in textbooks. Learning by doing. A learning in the terrifying real-time laboratory of a place where there was no margin for error because people died when you were wrong. She also had to learn, not just medicine. She already knew medicine. She had to learn Swahili, had to learn the local dialects, had to learn the customs, the beliefs, the deep and layered ways of understanding sickness and health and the body and the spirit that the Congolese people had developed over centuries, and that bore no resemblance to anything she had studied at Cambridge. She had to learn how to be trusted, how to be a guest, how to be a neighbor rather than a colonizer, which was no small thing for a white British woman in a country that had been colonized to near destruction by white Europeans. She made mistakes. She was proud. She would admit this herself. Amwe with characteristic, unflinching honesty in the memoirs she would write decades later. She was sometimes impatient, sometimes tactless, sometimes so driven by her vision for what the hospital should be that she steamrolled the very people she was trying to serve. She clashed with colleagues. She clashed with the missionary organization. She clashed frequently and painfully with herself, but she stayed. She built, year by year, brick by brick, life by life, she built. And here's what made Helen Roseveare different from so many of the well-meaning Western doctors who came before her. What made her work not just good work, but genuinely transformative work. She understood, with a clarity that was almost prophetic, that the goal was never to be indispensable. The goal was to make herself unnecessary. From the very beginning, she trained Congolese staff. She did not simply treat patients and send them home. She looked for the young men and women who showed intelligence and aptitude and hunger, and she invested in them with everything she had. She trained nurses. She trained paramedics and medical auxiliaries. She trained midwives. She taught people to diagnose, to prescribe, to perform basic surgical procedures that would have been unthinkable for village health workers to attempt just a decade before. She ran a nurses' training school that became one of the finest in the region. Students came from across the northeastern Congo, young people who had never had access to any kind of formal education, and they sat in her classrooms and they learned anatomy and pharmacology and surgical technique and the biology of infectious disease. They learned not because they had to, but because Helen made them understand why it mattered, made them understand that knowledge was power, and that power belonged to them, and that the communities they had come from needed them. Not their teacher, not the white missionary doctor, them. John Mangadima was one of those students. He would go on to become a doctor of exceptional skill, a healer whose reputation spread across the entire region. There were others, men and women whose names are not in any history book, but whose hands have touched more lives than most of us will ever know. They are Helen Roseveare's real legacy. Not the buildings she constructed, as impressive as they were. Not the thousands of patients she personally treated, as life-saving as that was. Her legacy is the people she trained, who trained people, who trained people, whose hands are working right now in hospitals and clinics across the Democratic Republic of Congo, doing exactly what she taught them to do. But even as the medical work grew and flourished, the world around Helen was shifting in ways that would eventually shatter everything she had built. In 1960, Belgium granted independence to the Congo. On paper, this was liberation. In practice, it was chaos. The colonial power had spent decades deliberately suppressing Congolese education and leadership, a calculated strategy to prevent any native-born political class from emerging. And the result was that a country of 14 million people suddenly had sovereignty without infrastructure, freedom without institutions, and a government that was fragile almost beyond repair from the first day. What followed was years of instability, power struggles, and violence. The Congo had been home to profound human suffering long before the Europeans arrived. But what colonialism had done was layer new fractures over old wounds, new grievances, new resentments, new divisions. And in the upheaval of independence, those fractures cracked open all the way to the bone. Helen watched all of this with the particular anguish of someone who has spent years building something in a place they love and now must watch the earth shake beneath it. She saw the country she had come to know and to love, the people she had delivered and healed and taught, caught in a grinding, merciless machinery of political violence. She saw her Congolese colleagues and friends caught between forces they had not chosen and could not control, and she stayed. She chose again and again to stay. By 1964, the violence had become a flood. In the northeastern Congo, a rebel movement known as the Simbas, which means lions in Swahili, swept through the region with terrifying speed and devastating brutality. The Simbas were ideologically complex. There were legitimate grievances about colonialism and inequality woven through their movement. But the way they prosecuted that movement was through a campaign of violence against civilians, particularly against anyone perceived to be connected to Western powers or to the educated elite. Missionaries were in extraordinary danger. Some had already been killed. Others had evacuated. The official advice, from governments, from missionary organizations, from every voice of practical reason, was to leave, to get out while there was still time, and to save themselves. Helen did not leave. Some of her colleagues had already gone, but she looked at her hospital, at the patients who were depending on her, at the nurses she was training, at the women in labor, at the children being carried in by mothers with desperate eyes, and she could not make herself go. So she stayed. In August of 1964, the Simbas arrived in Nebobongo. The world that Helen had built over 11 years, the world she had constructed from prayer and stubbornness and kerosene light and sheer force of will, became a war zone overnight. What happened to Helen Roseveare in those months under Simba control is something she has spoken about with more courage than almost anyone has ever spoken about anything. She was beaten. She was humiliated. She was subjected to treatment that no human being should ever be subjected to. She was assaulted, sexually assaulted, by men who were wielding weapons and who had turned cruelty into a tool of war. She lay on the floor of that hut in the dark, and she felt something she would later describe not as despair, but as a terrible, hollow ripping, a sensation of being torn from everything that had given her life meaning. Her faith, which had been the core of her identity since Cambridge, did not disappear, but it trembled, it groaned. It was pressed into a darkness so deep that she could not find the familiar shapes of comfort she had always known. She would later say, and these are her words, not my interpretation, her words, that in that moment, God spoke to her. Not in a voice, not in a vision, in something subtler and more shattering than either. A question, an impossible, devastating, beautiful question. She heard, in the depths of her suffering, the voice of Christ say to her, "Can you thank me for trusting you with this, even if I never tell you why?" Read that again. Let it land. Not a promise of explanation, not a guarantee of healing or rescue or justice. Just a question that reframed everything, that asked her to consider the possibility that suffering was not the absence of God's care, but the presence of God's trust, that she had been chosen not to be protected from this, but to carry it, to model something, to show the watching world what faith looks like when it has nothing left to stand on except itself. Helen Roseveare said yes. In the darkness of that hut, beaten and violated and alone, she said yes. She was eventually rescued in November of 1964 when Belgian and American paratroopers staged an operation to extract hostages from Simba-held territory. She was flown to safety, frail and traumatized, carrying wounds both visible and invisible. Most people would have gone home. Most people would have returned to England, put the Congo behind them, tried to rebuild a life of normalcy and safety. And no one could have blamed her. She had given more than anyone had a right to ask. She had suffered beyond what most people could imagine. She had earned the right to stop. But Helen Roseveare was not most people. She spent time in England recovering, speaking, processing. She wrote, she prayed, she sat with the questions that the Congo had burned into her, and she refused to let them go unanswered. And then, in 1966, just 2 years after the rebellion, she went back. She went back to the Congo, back to Nebobongo, back to the hospital she had built and that the war had partially destroyed, back to the nurses she had trained, who were still there, still working, still caring for people with the skills she had given them. Back to the red soil and the forest and the impossible, heartbreaking, irreplaceable work. She would serve there for another 7 years, 7 more years of surgery and childbirth and teaching and building, rebuilding what the war had broken, extending what had survived. She trained more nurses. She developed more programs. She worked with the same ferocity she had always worked with, but with something added now, a depth, a gravity. Yidom, a wisdom that only comes to people who have descended into the darkest places and climbed back out carrying light. By the time Helen Roseveare finally left the Congo in 1973, the medical infrastructure she had built, and more importantly, the people she had trained to staff it, had transformed the healthcare landscape of the region in ways that are almost impossible to quantify. The hospital at Nebobongo had grown from nothing into a functioning medical center with multiple wards, an operating theater, a laboratory, and a maternity wing. The nurses' training school had graduated hundreds of medical workers who were now spread throughout the northeastern Congo, carrying the skills she had taught them into villages and clinics and mission stations that had never had any medical care at all. And the infant and maternal mortality rates in the region had dropped dramatically, not back to some acceptable level, not to the kind of numbers that would satisfy a global health statistician, but dramatically, measurably, in ways that meant real babies lived who would have died, and real mothers survived who would have been buried in the red soil. And Helen had done this not by making herself the center of it all, but by designing systems, by training people, by deliberately, intentionally working toward her own obsolescence. She had built something that did not need her anymore, and that was the highest possible form of her achievement. Back in England, Helen became something else entirely. A teacher, a speaker, a writer, a voice. She joined the faculty of All Nations Christian College, where she trained a new generation of missionaries and medical workers. She lectured. She wrote books. Give me this mountain, living sacrifice. He gave us a valley, digging ditches. Books that were raw and honest and theologically profound in a way that made readers uncomfortable in the best possible way. She spoke at conferences around the world. She stood on platforms in America, in Canada, in Australia, and told auditoriums full of comfortable, well-fed, safe Christians the story of what she had seen and suffered and survived. She told them about the question God had asked her in the darkness. She told them about saying yes, and she challenged them, gently but with a steel thread running through every word, to ask themselves whether they were willing to trust God with their suffering, or whether they were willing to be used rather than simply blessed, whether they were prepared to be handed to the darkness for reasons they might never fully understand. She was not a soft speaker. She did not comfort people in the way that leaves them unchanged. She comforted them in the way that transforms them, by showing them something true about the nature of God and the purpose of pain and the terrifying, magnificent possibility of a faith that does not require explanation. Thousands of people heard Helen Roseveare speak and walked away permanently altered. Missionaries decided to go to the field because of her. Medical workers signed up to serve in impossible places because of her. Ordinary people sitting in pews in suburban churches found themselves unexpectedly cracked open by her words, found themselves asking, for the first time, whether their faith was something they were wearing or something they actually were. But here is what made Helen Roseveare truly extraordinary. What separated her from the countless missionaries who tell stories of triumph and glory and divine protection. She never pretended. She never glossed over the parts that were ugly and confusing and spiritually violent. She stood in front of audiences and she told them, I was broken. I was assaulted. I lay in that hut and I did not feel God's presence and I did not understand what was happening. And I was afraid in a way I had never been afraid before in my life. She told them about the loneliness, the grinding, structural loneliness of being a woman in a man's world, of being a professional in an environment that did not always know what to do with female ambition, of being someone who poured herself out for others and sometimes found herself desperately, privately empty. She told them about the clashes with leadership, the moments of doubt, the times she had knelt before God in frustration and said, I don't understand. I don't understand why this is happening and I need you to tell me. And she told them about the answer she kept receiving, which was not an explanation, but a presence, not a reason, but a relationship. Not, this is why I am allowing this, but I am here. I see you. I have you. Trust me. That was Helen's theology, forged not in a library, but on the operating table, and the mud floor and the rebel checkpoint. A theology of trust that went deeper than understanding. A faith that had been put in the fire so many times that everything soft and sentimental had burned away, leaving only what was absolutely indestructible. In her later years, Helen continued to speak and write and engage with the global church with a tenacity that was almost alarming for someone her age. She never really retired, because retirement implied that the work was finished, and the work was never finished. There were still people to train, still audiences to challenge, still the same stubborn, faithful, ferocious love for the church and the world that had driven her since Cambridge to burn in her like a coal. She was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire for her services to medicine in the Congo. She received honorary degrees. She was recognized by institutions and governments and religious bodies with the kind of accolades that get listed in obituaries. And she wore all of it with the air of someone who finds official recognition deeply beside the point. Not ungratefully, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who has stood in a place where the only audience that matters is the one that sees in the dark. Helen Roseveare died on December 7, 2016. She was 91 years old. She had spent 63 years serving God and the people of Africa in one form or another, either on the field or in the classrooms and conference halls from which she trained others to go. She died by all accounts at peace, not because her life had been easy, or even because it had been fully understood, but because she had spent it faithfully, and that was enough. The hospital at Bongo still stands. The Democratic Republic of Congo, which is what the Belgian Congo eventually became, and after decades of political transformation and trauma that would fill several more videos, is still one of the most medically underserved countries on earth. The need that Helen walked into in 1953 has not been fully met. It may not be fully met in our lifetimes. But because of Helen Roseveare, there are doctors and nurses and midwives and medical workers throughout the northeastern DRC who can trace their training, directly or indirectly, to the school she built and the students she taught and the philosophy she lived, which was train people well, trust them completely, and then get out of their way. Because of Helen Roseveare, so thousands of men and women who sat in conferences and read her books and heard her voice have taken their own questions about suffering into the darkness and come back with something they never expected. Not answers, but a deeper trust. Not explanations, but a firmer grip on the hand that is holding them in the night. Because of Helen Roseveare, the question she carried out of that rebel hut in 1964, "Can you thank me for trusting you with this?" is still being asked in hospitals and mission fields and ordinary living rooms all over the world. And people are still in their private darkness saying yes. And now that you have stayed, now that you have traveled this whole journey with Helen, I want to tell you the detail I promised you at the beginning, the detail that most people, even people who have read her books and heard her speak, have never fully reckoned with. It is this: years after the rebellion, years after the assault, the beatings, the trauma that would have destroyed most people, Helen Roseveare began to hear from Congolese Christians, from the very people who had been in Bongo during those years, from nurses she had trained, from patients she had treated, from men and women who had watched what happened to her and had carried that watching as a weight on their own souls. And what they told her was this: that her suffering had converted people, that the sight of a white missionary woman staying when she could have fled, enduring what she endured, and refusing to abandon them, not because she was fearless but because she chose to remain in her fear, had done something that years of medical work and sermons and Bible studies had not been able to do alone. It had shown them a God who was real enough to bleed for. There were Congolese men and women who came to faith specifically because of what they saw Helen suffer and survive and remain faithful through. Not in spite of her suffering, because of it. Helen learned this slowly, piece by piece, and when she fully understood it, understood that the worst thing that had ever happened to her had been used to bring people to the God she loved. She said something that I want you to hear very carefully, because it is one of the most theologically shattering things ever spoken by a human being who has actually walked through the fire. She said, "I know now, it was all worth it. Not it was okay. Not I forgive what happened. Not a polite, distanced acceptance of tragedy. It was all worth it. Every broken bone, every night on a dirt floor, every moment of terror and violation and aloneness, every single thing she had been asked to carry, worth it. Because God, who sees in the dark and works in the fire, had used it all. And here is the final, most striking detail of all. The thing that will sit with you, I believe, long after this video is over. Helen Roseveare never asked to be a martyr. She never asked to be a symbol. She went to the Congo to be a doctor, a servant, a woman with a stethoscope and a prayer and a willingness to stay. She went to deliver babies and suture wounds and train nurses and build things. She went to do ordinary, unglamorous, physically exhausting, practically important work. She did not go to suffer. She did not go to be remembered. She simply went. And in going, and in staying, and in suffering, and in returning, and in training, and in telling the truth about all of it without flinching, she became one of the most powerful testimonies to the reality of God that the 20th century produced. A woman, a doctor, a Brit with a temper and a brilliant mind and an inability to quit. A woman who was broken and broken again, and healed again, and who stood in front of 1,000 audiences and said, "I do not have all the answers, but I have met someone who does, and I would do it all again." That is Helen Roseveare. That is her faith. And that faith, her faith, still echoes. You have just heard the story of Dr. Helen Roseveare. And if it has moved you, if it has challenged you, unsettled you, lit something up inside you that you did not know was there, then I want to ask you to do something right now. First, share this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that faith does not require perfect conditions. Share it with someone who is sitting in their own version of a dark hut right now, wondering where God is. Share it with someone who thinks that women of faith are gentle and passive and decorative, and let Helen Roseveare correct that notion for them. Second, if you have not yet subscribed to Her Faith Echoes, please do it now. Every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories of women across history whose faith was so fierce and so real and so stubbornly human that the world could not contain it. Women who bled for what they believed. Women who built things that outlasted them. Women who said yes to God when every sensible voice around them was saying no. You deserve these stories. You need these stories. And we are here to tell them. Third, leave a comment below. Tell me, which part of Helen's story hit you the hardest? Was it the question God asked her in that hut? Was it her returning to the Congo only 2 years after the rebellion? Was it the revelation at the end? The knowledge that her suffering had brought people to faith? Tell me, this is not a broadcast. This is a conversation, and your voice matters here. And finally, wherever you are right now, whatever darkness you are walking through, whatever question is burning in you that has not yet received an answer, I want you to hear what Helen Roseveare heard in the worst night of her life. Can you thank God for trusting you with this? It is the hardest question in the world, and it is also the most freeing one. Because when you can say yes to that question, you discover that suffering does not have the last word, that darkness is not the end of the story, that the God who trusted Helen Roseveare with the fire is the same God who walks with you through yours. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. I will see you in the next story. Her faith echoes, and so does yours.